Hi, let's just see if we've got some people coming in. If you could pop something in the chat to say whether or not you can hear us, that would be fantastic. Lovely, good. Hello, Ben, thank you. Hope everyone had a nice lunch and had a chance to digest, or at least managing to eat while they're watching. We're just going to give a few more minutes for people to come in. We're expecting a few more to come along. Hi Claire, hi Susan, thank you.
Hi Anita, are you able to hear me okay?
Yeah, hi Jess, that's lovely. Thank you. Brilliant, lovely. Okie dokie. So I will get cracking. Firstly off, just to introduce myself and Jessica. We're place coordinators for the Think Communities team. I cover the South Cambs area and Jess covers the city. We're basically, I know it's been mentioned before, but we're basically your go-to for anything really. And I know it's been picked up quite a lot about the challenge of maybe getting hold of people within the county council. So please do familiarise yourself with your place coordinators. We all tend to have a specialism from where we've come from in previous roles and things like that. And today I'm going into my thematic area. So I have a particular interest around growth areas and supporting communities, which is why I'm running this workshop. But it's definitely worth saying that looking in the room, we have some experts here as well. So what my plan is to run through a couple of presentations with you. Not the most interactive, unfortunately. It's the nature of the beast. It would be so much better if we could do this in person. But yeah, we'll run through some presentations and then we'll try and get quite techie and change it over to a question and answer session. But throughout the presentation, please utilise the chat as much as possible. Jess is going to be keeping an eye on that, so she'll pick up any questions that are relevant. I've also been a little bit cunning and I've recorded my presentation so I can interact on the chat as well, just to make it a little bit more live. So hopefully that will help as well. Just to say, this presentation isn't going to be a toolkit or how to apply for Section 106 funding or CIL funding. We can't replace the really good advice that will come from your local planning teams. And I will reiterate this over the course of the workshop. It's so unique to each development. So there is going to be an element of, if you're looking for a toolkit, this might not be the right place, but I do hope it will give a little bit of inspiration, influence, maybe how you're looking to support growth in your own areas. And as I say, interactive towards the end to help you get going. So hopefully the technology is going to allow me to, I'm going to play you an interview that I recorded with James Fisher. So James Fisher is in the Combined Planning Authority for City and South, and an absolute expert. Many of you will know him already in terms of supporting parish councils to manage growth, to support growth, and to really get the best out of the planning process. So he's going to talk you through a little bit of the technical side of things. So I'm going to just see if we can run this video. Jess, could you just give me a thumbs up if that's, you can see the video screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, over to James then. Okay, hi James, thank you so much for joining us. Sorry I couldn't make it in real life, but you're going to run through some bits and pieces for us. Before we get onto that, I'm just going to share my screen to make sure everyone can see your slides. So that should now be showing. Okay, so firstly, I just wanted you to tell me a little bit about the mechanisms for securing developer contributions.
Hi Anita, sure. So infrastructure needed to mitigate the impact of the developments can be secured by several different means. For example, planning conditions are often used to facilitate off-site highways improvements. When it comes to financial contributions, these are made either through the community infrastructure levy payments or through planning obligations, more commonly known as Section 106 contributions. The community infrastructure levy is a form of development tax payable by most new developments. There are some exceptions, however. Affordable housing and self-build, for example, is not liable to pay any CIL contributions. In Cambridgeshire, the councils that have adopted CIL are Huntingdonshire and East Cambridgeshire. Section 106 contributions are payments that are negotiated between the applicants and the planning authority. Unlike CIL, Section 106 contributions are only paid when necessary. Section 106 is therefore the sole method of securing developer contributions from developments in Cambridge City, Fenland and South Cambridgeshire.
Thanks. Can you tell me a bit more about these Section 106 contributions?
Yeah, so Section 106 of the Town and Country Planning Act allows a landowner to enter into a legal agreement with the council. So this is used to prescribe what happens on the land and is relevant for such things as the provision and future arrangements for affordable housing and public open space. It's also used to secure financial contributions to mitigate the impact of the development. Importantly, this agreement is entered into before planning permission is issued, meaning that the local planning authority and stakeholders are required to assess the likely impact and seek its mitigation years before the impact is actually felt. Plainly, this is harder the bigger the developments. Even on small developments, the first occupation may be several years following the grant of planning permission. This is a complete contrast to the community infrastructure levy, where a council could decide after the houses are built how monies should actually be spent.
So you're saying that parish councils are allowed to ask for developer contribution via the Section 106 process?
Absolutely. However, each request must meet 3 tests that are set out in legislation. These are often referred to as the CIL tests. The regulations say that each contribution must be necessary to make the development acceptable, directly related to the development, and be fair and reasonable. It's the role of the decision taker to be satisfied that each request meets these tests. And by decision taker, I mean the planning officer, planning committee, or the planning inspector. I should also say that there's a high degree of subjectivity, and it's entirely possible that 2 planning professionals presented with the same information will reach a different conclusion as to whether a request is still compliant.
So how does one go about satisfying these tests?
Well, fortunately, the Planning Inspectorate has published a framework setting out the information that a decision taker should expect to receive. You need a policy in either the local plan or a neighbourhood plan. You need to be able to quantify the impact of the development in terms of pupil numbers or vehicle trips. You need to explain how the existing infrastructure cannot accommodate the impact. You need to explain how the contribution has been arrived at, and finally, you need to say what the money will be spent on. Each year, appeals are allowed throughout the country where the local planning authority has been unable to provide sufficient justification for a contribution, where the inspector subsequently found that the contribution had failed the CIL tests. Common reasons include the project being considered too far away from the development, that the impact of the development had not been clearly demonstrated, or even worse, because the council had failed to say how the money would be used at all. A judge once said that what is acceptable in planning terms is dependent upon a complex web of policies and other material considerations and a series of planning judgments. And so it's far from straightforward. What is necessary for one development may not be for another.
So finally, what are your recommendations for parish councils?
Well, parish councils are often responsible for key infrastructure, like recreation grounds, play areas, allotments, village halls and burial grounds, to name but a few. It's therefore clear that parish council input is critical in the Section 106 process. Without their participation, the development may still be approved, but contribute nothing to the village. First, I'd recommend parish councils speak with the planning department to better understand what the local plan says about planning obligations. The local plan should set out what is required, whether any quantitative standards are in place, and the threshold for infrastructure provision. They may also have a supplementary planning document explaining how much money a developer is expected to pay for these items. Second, the parish council should consider over the medium term what improvements are needed in the village. They should not wait until a planning application has been submitted to do this. Third, parish councils should think about how infrastructure may be provided or upgraded. They may have ambitions for improvements to things that require third-party land, and so they should initiate discussions with these landowners. Their ambitions may relate to areas that are actually the statutory responsibility of others, such as the county council in their role as education and library authority. Remember, the project needs to be deliverable to meet the tests. Getting support from the district councillor or county councillor also helps. Fourth, the parish council might want to consider how it's going to engage with the applicant when they are faced with a development proposal. I say this because in my experience, parish councils that have engaged, even where they may still object to the application, will secure more contributions than if they haven't engaged at all. Finally, the contribution is only one element of the story. The parish council would then be responsible for delivering the infrastructure that they've identified. An increasing phenomenon across councils is for service providers subsequently changing their mind on what they want to use money for, sometimes only a year or so after planning permission has been issued. Whilst it is possible to amend a Section 106 agreement at a later date, this can only be achieved with the approval of the landowner and the district council, which isn't always forthcoming. This further shows the need for proper planning, which is something that will be considered in the latter stages of the workshop.
Okay, guys, so I know, sorry, some people did lose a little bit of quality through that, but the beauty of having it all pre-recorded means that it's going to be very available for people if you want to watch it at a later point. So yeah, sincere apologies for those of you that lost a bit of sound quality through that. But I think what's really interesting there is what James is talking about is how to use the planning process in a way that is going to really support you to use the experts there within each of the planning teams that are relevant to you. And I should say that predominantly we are talking about Section 106 more than still in terms of a process you need to follow to be able to draw down on some of those opportunities. Now, for those of you in the areas where it is predominantly CIL, you already have access to that funding or know the system quite well. So we're not going to go into too much detail about that. But the next section of the presentation is really about kind of capturing what you can do with that money, which is equally important for both Section 106 and for CIL. So if you're all happy, we're going to move on to the next presentation. So this is me going back to my past self, doing a little presentation. It's a little bit weird, but it does just mean that, yeah, we can interact on chat a little bit better. So let's see if this one's ready to roll. And to be the new community strategic manager for Cambridgeshire County Council, responsible for working alongside planning to design and deliver support for those moving into large growth sites, which we refer to as new communities. I now work in the Think Communities team as the South Cambs Place Coordinator and take a lead on community-led support for growth. So the idea behind this presentation is to look at how best to support growth within communities. The challenge, of course, is that every community is different. So it's really important that we don't think that one size fits all. And for the purposes of this presentation, we really are going to be talking in quite general terms. It's worth saying that Think Communities is all about taking a people-centered approach to service delivery and empowering communities to be powerful and resilient and working with the relevant organisations to really take that place-based approach. So it is about making it as unique as possible to each area. But one of the things I hope is that we've learned a lot from looking at the big new communities, and it's taught us a lot that I think I've captured within this presentation that should help you to design and deliver support more locally that fit all the people moving into new homes in your local area. It's also important to point out that although my work often did get embedded within planning, I am most definitely not a town planner. So I'm not going to be going into too much detail into the process. James has covered that already. But if there's anything more technical, any questions you have around that sort of thing, I will feed them back to James and his equivalents in each of the planning services and make those connections for you. So we've got a fair bit to cover in today's presentation, and I'm going to make it a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. So please feel free to share any questions or any insights that you want to pop into the chat, and Jess will be keeping an eye on that. Before we really get started, little quote I kind of like to talk about is around post-war Britain. So that was when we first saw the big estate development, sometimes called new towns, sometimes garden cities, or simply mass housing projects, delightfully named. And it was not long after as we started to see things going, well, not so well for the people that moved in. And by the 1960s, there was already a fair few longitudinal studies on the impact of new town blues. So you fast forward to the modern day, and you would expect things to be different. But are they on a local level? And that's really what we're going to cover. You know, how can we learn from those lessons as we go into this presentation? So let's cover some of the ground I'm sure you're all familiar with. Scale of growth in Cambridgeshire is huge. It's one of, if not the fastest growing county in the country. The sites all are going to have a massive impact on the demographic makeup of the county. The population growth alone is going to put pressure on services. But we do plan for additional pressure on our infrastructure. We don't so much for our services and support. So that's something we need to bear in mind going forward. And a lot of the large sites have been a long time coming. But when the houses arrive, they really pop up quite quickly. So it can catch people unawares how quickly the growth can happen. To put it into a little bit more context, here's our prediction for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. These are just the large strategic sites. We're not counting the thousands of small infill sites, which will definitely impact the settlement. So you can see that the biggest growth is obviously around South Cambs and Peterborough. Cambridge City has already had significant growth, which wasn't captured in those numbers. East Cambs and Fenland have a lot more of the smaller developments, normally well below the 500 mark. So we need to take real big care that we're not defining growth areas by the number of houses. I think it's about the impact that those growth areas have. So let's talk about our experience. So moving house, we know, is one of the most stressful things you can do, yet people do it all the time. So what I want you to do just for a few seconds is cast your mind back to when you have moved to a new area, away from families and friends. And once that initial excitement had passed, what did it feel like? Who was the first person you met locally? At which point did you feel that you belonged to the area? It's just worth kind of having a reflection. And certainly I know that my experiences moving up from Cornwall, it did take a little bit of time to really get to feel like I belonged in this flat country. But I do know the first person I really met locally and what an impact they had. But it's worth reflecting. For some people in some areas, that first welcoming person never comes. Some people just don't feel comfortable throwing themselves into the community, or don't feel that those within the community really want them there. And that's certainly something we know happens where there's big big sites have that local pressure not to happen. When people move in, they do tend to feel a little bit alienated. They do see the posts on the local Facebook pages all about their new homes. So often they don't know about the local support services, or even where there's a cafe. There's no one to show them where everything is, and some things start to get a little bit more daunting. As I mentioned, new town blues is something we're really aware of and prepare and mitigate for in the larger developments. In fact, any development over 1,000 homes. But anecdotally, we know it's happening at much smaller developments as well. So we need to look at where the mitigation is at a local level that could really make a difference. So let's explore that in a little bit more detail. So terms of the professional side of things, following concerns that things weren't going so well in Camborne and Orchard Park, where, you know, I'm going to be quite frank, there was high suicide rates. At one point, it was we saw the highest in the country. We had local news outlets printing headlines like gang warfare in Crimeborne and Arbery prison camp. So my role was created to really start to unpick what was going on in those new communities and come up with a new approach to avoid it happening again in other areas, particularly trying to think of new approaches in the 3 core sites at that time, which was Southern Fringe, Northstowe and Alconbury Weald. One of the first things we looked at was referral rates in the 2 new communities. So referral, what we mean by that is those that are needing additional support. And in this case, we're looking at what was called locality teams or child and family centres and children's social care. We're using that as a bit of a proxy. So we looked at Southern Fringe in Cambridge and St Neots Love Found, and we found that these 2 communities are experiencing much higher social care referral rates than the rest of that area, and around twice as many referrals than you would expect from a comparatively established community. And since that early look at the data, and this is going back quite some time, 2014 was when we first started looking into it. But since then, we've done a deeper dive, and we've looked at the wider agencies involved in supporting families. And again, we found that pattern of residents in new builds requiring extra public sector interventions than we would expect in an established community. And they do need that help for a number of years. It's not long term, but it can, depending on the scale of the growth, it can depend on how long that support is needed. So luckily, we've got experience of growth sites in Cambridgeshire. So we've got Bar Hill going back in the 70s, Camborne in the late 80s, Orchard Park in the 90s, which has enabled us to really draw some of our understanding. Unfortunately, we have found that in new communities built in Cambridgeshire, they have all faced difficulty very early on, with families having poor outcomes, and an additional need has stretched services and support across organisations and the voluntary sector. And that's been quite significant. But we were determined that the referrals need to be understood in a bit more detail. So we started to look at where the referrals were coming from. And interestingly, they are tenure blind, with a disproportionate number coming from market housing in comparison to the norms that we see in established communities. So that's worth bearing in mind. And we were also able to determine that 80% of those referred were not known to the local authority prior to moving to the new development, which sort of suggests there is something about moving to a new home that has affected that person's well-being and ability to cope, which then of course takes you down to the why. Well, it's not rocket science, and from many professional interviews, we've done case studies, we've run some focus groups, it's clear that most of these issues really stem from poor social networks, meaning the normal stresses and strains quickly become exaggerated. Some of that is exacerbated in the new communities, so the bigger sites, purely because of the scale of people in the same sort of situation. But we are seeing it when people move into an area and then don't feel connected with that area. So the same thing comes across there. And it's kind of worth thinking about when someone walks into a room beaming and all smiling, it's really hard for everyone else within the room not to start smiling as well. And when you have a concentration, say 50 homes of people that are, you know, struggling a little bit, feeling a little bit flatter, they're not smiling, and that kind of effect does carry over. It's you know, metaphorically speaking, we need to get the smile back into people that are moving into the area. So it's really worth stressing that we believe it's important for all growth areas, not just the strategic sites, to think about how new communities could be supported as they move in. How can they be welcomed into the community, and how can local services and support be made more accessible to them? And realistically, that's not only going to benefit the new residents, but those in the established community as well. So as James mentioned, we've got to talk about mitigation, and over the last few years we've developed a number of strategies to help us better support new communities, and through the research on the new communities policy documents, we've now got that kind of like justification that really helps us there. And as I say, these documents are geared towards the large strategic sites, but they do have relevance on the smaller pockets of new builds as well, both in terms of policy and best practice. So in keeping with Cambridgeshire County Council's Think Community approach, which is all about collaboration between partners, co-production with communities, and asset-based, place-based, community-led solutions, is a bit of a mouthful. We've come up with the strategic vision, but I think it's really helpful to look at this in terms of places, people, and system. So it's making sure that the infrastructure around a community is suitable both now and for in the future. So it's making it accessible, making it welcoming, thinking about things like dementia-friendly green spaces. You know, how do people fit within the area? And some of those places are about just influencing the planning of these new homes. Then we've got the people side of things. This is all about the community development. This is my favourite bit. But it's about really understanding how do you make people connect to their local community? How can you build their social networks so they don't feel isolated on moving in? And then there's the side of the system, and that's more about, you know, is there access to a library facility? Can they get onto the computers before their internet provider is set up? You know, one of the biggest things about new builds is you don't have an address properly set up for ages. So lots of deliveries, lots of even house insurance, it becomes a bit of a problem. So it's looking at those kind of systems and what locally can happen to help those community or to help those new families out. And then we've got our key principles, and here is the key thing is that we should be working together as much as possible to support these new families coming in. You know, reflecting back on those 3 CIL tests, it's important that mitigation is relevant to the development. So every mitigation will be unique. But these guiding principles are going to work whether we're looking at a 50 home development or a 5,000 home development. So firstly, let's look at co-production. There is limited resource. It is hard to get developer funding. So it's important that, you know, in those early stages, it makes sense that we're not duplicating things and we're pooling our finances together and coordinating to be as most effective as possible in those early stages. Oops, sorry, it just flicked the slide. So yeah, I think the co-production side is really good, and that's about linking kind of county, district, parish town councils alongside health and police and fire. And it would always be a stronger case to put in front of developers if you have that coordinated kind of approach. And, you know, you can show that you've involved the community itself. So your established community, getting those involved, that gives a sense of sustainability to it, as well as just feeling like the right thing to do. In terms of innovation, simply not repeating the same mistakes is a good innovation, but it's a feeling that we should really not focusing on providing service to the people that move in, but really it's kind of like we don't want to hamper any community group from starting because we've delivered it instead. So instead of providing a paid for play group, having a parent-led play group has got a lot more sustainability to it. It's tough, but thinking along those lines is going to be really important. So yeah, a lot of that innovation is about empowering the individual and the community to help themselves. And a community needs to be built first before it can be developed. I understand that, but absolutely the best innovation will not come from a formal meeting or asking people to, you know, click their fingers and come up with ideas on the spot. It'll be about having that, you know, really meaningful engagement with the community that's there already. And learning what made a difference to them when they moved into the community and what kind of skills and assets they've got that they could use collectively to support new members of the community joining. And it's definitely, you know, like I mentioned before, it's tough for a community to switch from fighting a development to supporting a development, and that takes quite a lot of hard work to develop. And lastly, just talking about co-location. So we've got quite a lot of examples about how community facilities can be used better. You know, it's not just about having a drafty village hall that might not be appealing. It might not be appealing to established community, let alone people that are moving in. So sometimes it's around looking at shared uses, prioritising space locally for informal meeting spaces. Maybe that's cafes, like I mentioned before, maybe it's about parent-led groups. It's about having that ability to kind of like bring things together and really start to, you know, become a welcoming place for people to meet each other. And it's worth saying for some organisations, having that backseat presence in these facilities enables them to be part of the community and be on the ground and recognise when someone's in need of help. Again, that might be your social prescriber, giving them space to run activities or groups within the area. Maybe it's about saying, you know, we're going to have free space for the book club to come and run, you know, just something to kind of kickstart that action, but also means that, you know, there's people who are running alongside, so the book club starts to know the social prescriber and vice versa, and it just makes that ability to link in. So I think, you know, co-location is also the mechanism where you can start, you know, getting community activity to grow, and you know, as I say, just linking those kind of supports together. And I think it's a really good example in Gamlingay, where we've got like Kingfishers, which is helping those with additional needs with a kind of day centre kind of model, and it's run alongside the community cafe. And actually the links, and there's a bit of a blurring. It's really fascinating to talk to those involved, which I was very lucky to do recently, just to hear how there's a bit of a merging and actually greater things come from just co-locating people together. So I think that's a really important thing to think about when you are planning what you're going to do to support the new people moving into your area. A little bit of a technical bit, it's probably as technical as ever I'm going to get. I thought it might be helpful just to share the process we tend to expect when we're looking at the larger sites. One thing I've definitely learned along the way is that no two sites are the same in terms of timescale, but I hope this helps to show a little bit about how much is involved in building the case for a request for supporting communities. For the small sites, they're bound to skip some of the steps, you know, such as master planning, but overall it's pretty similar. And from a local council point of view, it's important to support your established community to make that mindset change. So giving extra time around that, getting people engaged, involved in, you know, how we're going to help these people to fit in when they move in. And it's so much more effective if that's done locally. So definitely put time in to engage with your communities. It's about kind of requesting the support of the people who are moving into the homes as well. So yeah, sometimes when we're saying to planners, for example, you know, we want to support people once they've moved in, the planning process has kind of achieved its goal when the house has been built and someone's moved in. Our job is to kind of go, but we need to take that process and move it on a little bit more. So sometimes that can have a bit of a mixed reception from both planners and developers. And it is in part due to a lack of understanding. So that often means that although we're asking for things at a fraction of the cost of the more common requests, such as buildings or roads, the more innovative requests are a little bit more likely to be cut at, you know, the viability discussions. So we have to be that little bit more prudent with how we're pulling things together. We need to provide more evidence. We need to have harder justification. We need to prove there is a need. So again, it's so important to start that process as early as possible to allow enough time for the engagement to happen. So very quickly, I just wanted to say that we did spend quite a lot of time aligning kind of general needs with statutory duties. And so, you know, we did work really closely with planners, frontline services to understand what would make it proportional and make sure that we were as clear as possible that this is funding someone's day job. This is about preventing a normal peak on needing support services or an unusual, you know, lack of well-being in an area. So all this information is available. If you're interested in getting some of that justification together, please just get in contact. This is like one element of very, very detailed spreadsheet that we can certainly share with you. So let's move on to what that looks like in practice. So, oh, yeah, there we go. So a case study in terms of Southern Fringe. Now I've picked this one because it is a big site, but some of the more, it was one of the first ones we started to look at a little bit differently. And as such, a lot of the interventions, for want of a better word, is very much on the smaller scale that would work really well and transfer nicely to some of the smaller sites. So yeah, Southern Fringe, like 4,000 homes there or thereabouts, mostly all occupied now. As I say, one of the first sites that we started looking at differently. And even though it's a really affluent area, we saw, and I alluded to this at the beginning, we did see quite considerable higher needs in the development than you would expect. And we're still learning from what happened in Southern Fringe as well. So I wouldn't say we've necessarily you know, got it all sorted. But one of the fundamental things that I think really made a difference is that the City Council established a kind of like partnership group where lots of different agencies, it was called the Community Children and Families Subgroup, if memory serves, and it came up with an action plan of how each of the partners, and that included BPHA, the Housing Association, the Residents Association from the established community in Trumpington, lots of different VCS groups. They all came together and basically I used some more generic funding that came from developer funding to start looking at different things that could support the community. So they helped kind of create networks, lots of things that are very easy to replicate on a smaller scale, sort of welcome packs, having social events, really enabling clubs to operate. So they're very interestingly within their community facility, they actually set aside certain times where they'd have free access for any local group, or you can have free access for the first 3 sessions you run as a new group, just to help kind of kickstart it going. And I think that's something that, you know, they subsidized with some of the funding they got from the developers, but it just helped to target into the new residents there. They did commission a really, well, collectively, we commissioned a really interesting project that was run by Cambridgeshire Mind around looking at asset-based community development. So getting as many people in the community involved in doing things for others in the community. And that was really successful. And a lot of lessons were learned from that. It was a large amount of funding spent on it, but it was a big area. And I think that can be adapted. And there's all sorts of organisations out there that will be able to run projects along those lines. And they also gave kind of like, it was called community chest funding that the City Council provide, but developer funding was put into that to enable people to, or groups to bid for soft play, you know, things, or to run particular groups, just that kickstarting funding was really interesting. They also looked at the wider aspects, you know, so they looked at digital inclusion, particularly as I mentioned, back when residents were moving into Southern Fringe, it really was tricky to get connected. So it was like, you know, using that public access, Wi-Fi and things like that to help people not be excluded digitally. They did lunchtime clubs for people in the area so that, you know, the kids could start to meet, particularly if they're moving at the beginning of the summer holiday, for example. It's a long time of not getting to know people and parents not getting to know. So it's things like that. But lots of activities that were really geared towards, you know, supporting people once they moved in. And again, yeah, that collaborate thing, I cannot stress enough how important it is to get everybody working around the same table, and really kind of sharing that expertise and knowledge. And again, that's important at the point of requesting funding through Section 106 or planning how you're going to use CIL funding. It's just that collective group brings you so much more. The last little case study I wanted to talk about was Melbourne Hub. So this is very much more about the infrastructure, and I think we've got some reps from Melbourne Hub on the call. So I'm sure they'll be able to provide some more information and would be more than happy. I know they'll be more than happy to share their collective experience and knowledge to help anyone that's planning for a big infrastructure project. But again, it was very innovative how they looked at funding streams, how they used developer funding, how they matched that up with other things, and how they engaged the community. I think that was really important bit for me. So they really spent the time going out, talking to members of the community, finding out what's important. And I love their strapline that's now very nicely displayed above their library access point, which is, you know, the hub was built for the community by the community. And I do believe that's true. And you can feel how people feel passionately locally about the hub, how it draws people in. It's a great place to meet people, but it doesn't feel too intimidating or daunting if you're new to the area. It's very visible. It helps that kind of, it's created that bumping space that means that social networks can start to form. Plenty of spaces for community activity to happen. The access point is that the library area is that, you know, easy, neutral place where people can come in. And it's a really good example of how developer funding can be used to support the community well beyond just bricks and mortar. So really important for me. And just for the last little few moments, I just wanted to kind of summarize that in terms of planning to support your community, think about the people moving in, and think about that first time when you moved into an area. What made a difference for you? What stage of your life were you in? What was relevant to you at that point? Have those early conversations, talk to people that have moved into the village recently, get that kind of understanding. But ultimately it's about prepare and get that evidence together. And of course we'd be willing to help wherever possible on that sense. It's also, as I say, really stressing that it's important to work alongside all your partners, community groups in your area, anything like that, and learn from each other, lean from the experiences of others, because no two sites are going to be the same. It is just about understanding what's relevant to your local area and planning that way. There's my contact details. I'm easily got holdable at the county council. I know we regularly send out information to our South Cambs parish and town councils, and there's a place coordinator for each of the areas. You probably know your place coordinator very well. Get in contact with them and they will be able to help you as well in planning for that. Okay, so hopefully that was useful. Some good bits and pieces coming on the chat. So what I'm going to try to do is just change this over to a Q&A session, which means you can put your hand up, you can turn your video on, you can, you can basically get a little bit more involved. So we'll give that a quick go. If we lose anyone, then we'll see you back in the lobby, but hopefully it will work. Okay, so I do believe that's worked. So you should now have on your view, you should be able to now put your hand up and yeah, just seeing how that might look. Yeah, I was just wondering, there's a few things while we're working through that came up in the chat that I noticed. First thing was about early provision of community facilities. And I think that is a really important aspect. And I think it's one of the things for the big sites, it's always going to be tricky because there is that need for the viability to be met, and developers do kind of put up a bit of a fight around providing anything too soon. But meanwhile use is something we see a lot more within new communities, and something that's been hugely utilised within Northstowe, where we've built full primary school in Northstowe, but only utilised 3 wings of it, which has enabled us to use the spare wing as a community centre before the community centre is built, which isn't planned to be built for a couple more years yet. So I think there's an element of trying to look at meanwhile use and seeing how that actually works. But I think as well, it's about putting that pressure on and having those early conversations with developers about the need for facilities. And I think one of the things that's really interested me during my work with new communities is that actually, you know, it doesn't have to be perfect. Those early community facilities can be quite straightforward. And we've seen a lot of experience across the country where, you know, containers or, you know, mobile units, you know, have been really effective to provide that before the true facility is definitely there. Does anyone want to sort of comment on that, or you should have a raise hand facility underneath your name, I think. Okay. The other thing that was interestingly brought up was around scale, and there's lots of different arguments about this. So is it better to have lots of very small developments or combine it together to make one big development? You know, what does that do in terms of pressure on the existing system, and what does that do in terms of being able to get facilities in place? So I think there is no right answer to that, and I think it's very much around the local side of things, but certainly we can ask for more you know, big asks, like big community centres, brand new community centres, if the development's big enough. We can ask for schools if the development's big enough to warrant it. But if it's lots of small developments, it's very hard to ask for a little bit of a contribution from each of them. So I think that's my counter argument for lots of small developments. But then I think in terms of feeling that sense of place and feeling connected to your community, obviously the smaller the better, because it then enables people to feel they are part of the community, not part of a sub-community or you know, a different area. I always think it's quite interesting that when you talk to people who live in the likes of, say, Northstowe, for example, you ask them where they live, they will refer to their area by the house developer. So I live in the Blore site, or I live in the Wimpy site, as opposed to saying I live in Northstowe or I live in South Cambs. So it's about kind of changing that kind of, you know, sense of place, I think is a good term. Yeah, does anyone want to pop their hands up or talk or add anything to the list? Let's see, we've got Ben. Yeah, would you like to speak? Let's get your audio on.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Lovely. Hi, Ben.
Hello. So yeah, it's really interesting. Just well, all of it, but particularly in the comment that your reply to me about having revenue funding via CIL sounds like it's more likely. Does that tend to be sort of revenue funding that's attached to an infrastructure project, or could it actually be CIL is used for a revenue project? Because I think the things you're describing about community building, often you do need the structures, but the thing that often disappears in that menu of options is the sort of the ongoing, you know, staff really to deliver the best version of that.
Exactly, and I think that's it. And I think most of the time, the anchor is the infrastructure side of things. So it's an expansion of a village facility, or you know, those sorts of things. It is that kind of bricks and mortar infrastructure thing. But alongside that, it is very possible, as long as you're sticking to those 3 CIL tests, as long as it's about mitigating the impact of people moving into the area, so making it less likely that they are going to struggle to integrate into the community. You can see I'm going slightly into planning talk there, but you can put in revenue. There's nothing within the planning policy or law, for want of a better word, that says you can't have revenue side of things. The big CIL list, so in the authorities that have adopted CIL, then you can't use the main CIL funding for revenue projects, but the contribution that gets given to local town and parish councils can be utilised to the best of that area's ability to support the community. So you do have that flexibility. And like I mentioned in my presentation, it's the harder route. It is more difficult. You do have to really push the argument forward and justify it much more than you would do if you were building an extension to a building. But it is very possible, and it's well worth having those conversations with your planning advisor within your local authority as soon as possible, really.
Oh, that's really interesting. So yes, in the we've got a lot of new builds. We've got a neighbourhood plan, so we have 25% of the silver seats at the town council, and so we've always worked within quite a tight framework in terms of what is and isn't allowed. But in terms of the responsible officer who makes that call, would that be the head of planning at our district council that would have an overall jurisdiction?
Yes, that's right. They'll have the ultimate decision on whether that goes in front of developers or whether it forms part of the overall plan. But again, I think it's in the past, we haven't been great at justifying the need for that revenue support. And sometimes it is, a little bit about looking at things cleverly, like saying, actually, I'm going to commission a project to support that. So it isn't quite revenue as in staff costs. It's more about purchasing a project that then gets run. But it's happening across the country now. It's not unique to Cambridgeshire. So yeah, there's a lot more opportunity there, and it's well worth having those conversations with the Hunts team.
Great, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, let's see. Just looking through the chat there. So I heard about just seeing this from Kirsten around the county council refusing or objecting on policy for cycleways and footpaths. It's very difficult because we do have some overarching policy documents that are already looking at things like cycleways and footpaths, and this is definitely not within my expertise at all. But Kirsten, I would definitely suggest really having a conversation with the team there, the objective, to find out why, because objection and accepting are so black and white. There's normally a bit of a story behind that, and it's well worth having those conversations to find out why. There's so much pro cycleways and footpaths. You really are pushing against an open door there, so I would definitely open that conversation up again. And apologies, I can't help in any more detail on that particular case just because it's not something I'm particularly familiar with. But yeah, definitely reopen those conversations, and if I can be of any help to facilitate that conversation, please do get in contact. Okay, any other questions at all? Okie dokie. Well, as I say, very easy to get hold of us. Please do feel free to ask any questions. What I'm going to do is I will close down this workshop so you can pop back into the lobby, have a look at the booths or the networking area. I'm waiting for your next workshop, which should start in about 20 minutes. So that gives you a 20-minute tea break if you want to, but please do feel free. Myself and Jess will be here in this room and we'll keep it on Q&A format. So if you do want to stay with us, please do. If not, you can pop back into the main lobby waiting for your next workshop to begin. Thank you, everyone.